Today we're having a special edition of Going to the Village. The whole show is going to be devoted to a new book that is out, and it's about a Virginia village goes to war. And with us today we have one of our renowned authors and historians, Brad Gernand, who has just written a second book. I have a copy of his first book here called Falls Church, A Virginia Village Revisited. It was by Brad Gernand and by Nan Netherton. An excellent book put out in 1999. This book, which was recently put out, is called, like I said, A Virginia Village Goes to War, Falls Church During the Civil War. It was written solely by Brad Gernand. Brad, welcome.
Thank you.
And Brad is archivist. He's been with the Library of Congress, and he's now with another agency down in Alexandria as the archivist, and done a lot of research on what happened in Falls Church. Before I get you going on this, I want to tell a little story. In October of 2001, I got a call from you, and you asked me if I could be one of the readers of your book to see, to go over it and give my opinion of it, maybe a little editing of facts and concepts and stuff like that. And this was obviously right after 9/11, and our troops and world troops are already into Afghanistan, and we're watching a lot on the news about how in the little villages of Afghanistan, it really didn't matter what side you were on, you were in trouble. And things were going to happen to your life that were not pleasant. And we were inundated with that every day on the news. And then I read your book, and it was so touching to know that where I lived, literally in Falls Church, the same thing happened during the 1860s. And your book vividly tells that story about it almost doesn't matter whether you were Northern sympathizer, Southern sympathizer, I didn't care about either, you're in deep trouble. So what I'd like you to do today, if you can go through this wonderful, wonderful book with us and tell us some of the stories. You have great chapter headings, great pictures, great stories. Do you mind telling us a few and letting the readers know what page you're on and chapter and everything, and let's just go through it.
Thank you, Dave. I'd be happy to. And thanks very much for having me.
Oh, sure.
So yes, I'll walk you through the book fairly quickly and just kind of give you an idea as to how it came about and that sort of thing. As you mentioned, Ms. Netherton and I had published a book in 2000 to mark the 300th anniversary of Falls Church's establishment. Well, while we were compiling that book, I was supposed to write the Civil War chapter, and so I was working on finding information for it. And lo and behold, not only did I not find enough for a chapter, which had been my original worry, but I found a whole lot. And in fact, that chapter is my least favorite chapter because I know what it doesn't contain. Because keep in mind, I had to have just one chapter devoted to the Civil War because the book had to cover an entire 300 years of recorded history.
Now, you're talking about this book,
I am
Virginia,
talking about the
Blue Book.
The Blue Book, so to
Right,
speak.
right.
And so what came to transpire was, as soon as we finished that book and it became for sale and launched itself, I then decided that the time was nigh. I had all of the research materials at home, and I still had in my mind where I had found what. I knew what existed and what didn't. And plus, I still had some tantalizing trails to follow. I knew I was going to find more. And so I decided to simply sit down and put together a manuscript and see what happened. And I also decided, even before I set out, that I was going to publish it no matter what. So I thought that it should be produced in some way, and so that kind of gave me the impetus to bring it all to a close.
Okay, I'm going to interject this. I am not a fan of reading about the Civil War. Actually, I don't like reading about war at all, but I was totally enthralled by this book. Why should anybody care about what's in this book?
Good question, and I think I have the answer for that.
Okay.
I believe that you and anyone else and me, I think we should care about the story, not necessarily the book, because the book tells the story of a people and a place. So I like to say it's not actually a military history. It just happens to be the story of what happened to a people and a place during a military conflict. And I know exactly what you mean about how it seems so apropos to today. That was one of the things that fascinated me the most about this book, is because, how much things have changed and yet they haven't changed at all. The things that were on their minds then, the same problems, are with us today.
I felt heart in this book. in most civil wars, this person killed that person. There was this terrible thing that happened. But I felt a lot of heart in here. And I did feel a lot of empathy for many of the people in this book.
They were very human, weren't they?
Yeah.
I discovered the same thing. I really became almost as though I were friends with them.
Yeah.
I knew so much about what happened to them by the end of the book that I felt almost as one, so to speak. And in fact, a couple of times during the writing of the book, when everything would flag and I would think, I'm just not doing well, or I just need to pick up the research a bit, I would go over to the Falls Church Episcopal's churchyard. And I would simply sit, and I recognized most of the names on the tombstones.
That's this right here.
That's
on
the
your
church
former
right
book.
there, pictured on the former book.
Right.
And so they were definitely an inspiration.
Let's go right to some of the illustrations you have here.
Why don't we start then on page 10?
Feels like a reading, doesn't it?
It does feel like a reading. What I published on page 10 is word that Falls Church might have received first. In fact, it probably did receive first, that South Carolina had seceded from the Union. That was in 1860, but it presaged everything that was to occur here later, because when South Carolina sort of dissolved the Union by removing itself, suddenly all the states had to figure out, what was going to be their point of view on the matter, and the same with Virginia. Virginia at that time was a very moderate place, and Falls Church was a particularly moderate town in a moderate state.
It's kind of like when the United States went into Iraq, everybody else had to decide which side they were on quickly.
That's true, and they didn't have the luxury of time.
Right.
And so families, sometimes had Southerners and Northerners in each. Churches had Southerners and Northerners.
I did.
It was a very difficult time for them. So on page 10, I publish it's a very famous broadside, and it's the originals in the Library of Congress, but it says Charleston Mercury, which was a newspaper, extra, and then at the bottom, the Union is dissolved. Well, that news came to Falls Church and really electrified affairs here, because suddenly things that people had been discussing for months were at the boiling point, and everyone realized that things had reached a point of no return. So what was going to happen next? What happened next was a fairly radical man named John Brown, who was an abolitionist, and he's actually pictured on page 11 of my book. John Brown galvanized public sentiment in the North because he began an abolition campaign. He wanted to free the slaves, and to do so, his first major move was to capture the United States Arsenal at Harper's Ferry in what is now West Virginia. At that time, it was Virginia. And he intended to capture the arsenal and open it up and take the arms out and distribute the arms to the slaves so that the slaves could then revolt against their masters. That was actually put down by Robert E. Lee, who was a United States Army officer at that time. And so the entire issue at Harper's Ferry, ceased to be a problem. John Brown was captured by Robert E. Lee, and he was executed by the state of Virginia. What happened then was that many of the Northerners expressed dismay that John Brown had been captured and that his entire attempt to free the slaves had failed. When the Northerners began feeling that way and making their sentiments very known, the Southerners, no matter whether they were conservatives or liberals or moderates, felt very threatened because they felt that the Northerners just were not understanding their point of view.
So that happened right here in Falls Church, those feelings.
The feelings happened right here in Falls Church because even though plantation farming was never much of a going concern here at Falls Church, there were slaves here. And also, even if the Southern-born residents here did not have slaves, they felt that they were being persecuted by the North.
Well, you have a picture here, you have a document here of John Doolin, we have the Doolin Methodist Church.
We do.
And it says here that about the slaves, and it talks about it. So there were quite a few slave owners here in Falls Church, weren't there? And
Doolin was one of the largest slaveholders. Mm-hmm. His farm is now what is now off Lee Highway between Graham Road and Gallows Road. It was about 1,000-acre property, so very large, and he had a large number of slaves. And in fact, his slaves began deserting as soon as the war opened. And the illustration you mentioned on page 11 of the book is one I found in a Maryland newspaper in 1793, and it was for Doolin's ancestor, who also was a slave owner. And it's simply talking about the fact that he has lost one of his slaves. The slave has run away, and he's asking for, I guess, white people anywhere to find the slave and capture him and then return him to Falls Church. So as you can see, there were slaves in Falls Church from a very early point, and they weren't necessarily happy with their lot in life, seeing as how one had run away. So now let's move forward to page 13. What happened next, as I mentioned, is that families and churches all began dissolving and splitting. In the case of families, they would often find that one brother might follow the northern point of view and the other brother might follow the southern point of view. And so in some cases, in Falls Church, a number of cases, families dispatched sons to the Northern Army and to the Southern Army.
It happened in my family, yeah.
Did it?
Yeah.
And in fact, your family was in New York, is that right?
At that time, they were in Indiana,
And
southern Indiana. So they met at the Battle of Vicksburg.
oh well, an inglorious meeting, I'm sure.
Yeah, right.
In Falls Church, things turned fairly ugly. The Columbia Baptist Church at that time sat at what we now call the downtown intersection, and it had been finished in 1856. And the photo that I show on page 13, is one of the first photographs I have ever seen of Falls Church, and it apparently is of the church, of the Columbia Baptist Church, just after it was finished. So sometime in 1856. And the reason I picture the church is because of what happened to it. It was even though it was Baptist, it was a northern-born congregation. Many of them hailed from New York and other points north, even further north of New York. And the local Southerners wanted to send a definite message to them. And so they set the church on fire. Now, if you'll keep in mind, Dave, that was a very religious age. And almost everyone identified himself as a Christian. And many of them also went to church and practiced it formally. And so to set a church on fire will show you the extreme depth of the feelings that Falls Church was experiencing. What happened in the case of Columbia is that the fire was set and started, was discovered, or perhaps it had been known about in advance, and it was put out before it could do much damage. And then the local northern-born residents were attempting to find the perpetrator. And so far as I know, no one was ever formally charged. But then on the other hand, the war broke out very shortly thereafter, so there wouldn't have been an authority here to bring charges.
So these churches really did split up. I mean, the Methodist Church split into three, with the Crossman Methodist Church for Northern sympathizers, the Southern white sympathizers to the Doolin, and then African Americans formed the African Methodist Episcopal, which is now Galloway.
That's right. A point of clarification on that would be that in all cases, including the one you just mentioned with the Methodists, the churches failed at the very beginning of the war, in that wartime spring of about 1861, and there were no working congregations in Falls Church until sometime after the war. In the case of the Falls Church Episcopal, I think they did not reorganize as a congregation until about 1874.
That's a long time.
It was a long time after the war.
And the Baptists, I know after that, continued to have a Columbia Baptist, but then there was a second Baptist church for African Americans, which is still in existence.
That's true. And a third Baptist church, I think.
That split off from the second, right?
Mm-hmm. And so, yes, you're right. In all cases, the churches failed because, in the case of the Methodist, as example, the entire Methodist movement nationwide was splitting between northern and southern elements. And all local churches on the border states, as Virginia then was, had to figure out, would they follow the north or the southern faction? And in the case of Falls Church, the church simply failed completely.
So this is an example of something we're experiencing today that is a definite reflection from 145 years ago.
As I mentioned, some things never change.
It's really interesting. Okay, thank you.
In the case of the Methodists, my understanding is they later reunited, and that's why we call them now the United Methodists.
Right.
But in the case of the Baptists, there is still the American Baptists, which are the northern, and the Southern Baptists, which are the southern.
Right.
They have never yet
Right.
reunited. So let's move on to page 19, because on page 19 I illustrate a man named William Gwynn Coe, and he was the reverend of the Methodist Church at Falls Church. Now, what happened is his church not only failed, but one of the reasons it did so was because he was an ardent secessionist. A secessionist was anyone who wanted Virginia to secede from the Union, or secession. That's the root word there. So he wasn't able to preach his fiery secessionism from the pulpit anymore, and so he fled and went to Warrenton, and he continued to preach secession from his pulpit there.
So now he lived in what's now Mount Hope. Is that correct?
Yes, that's my
Oh,
understanding.
it's actually a portion of what is now the wooden part of the house.
That's right.
And there's a stream named after him called the Coe Branch of Tripp's Run, which goes past what is currently the Red Lobster and into a woods there.
And in fact, Mount Hope One of the strange things I discovered in writing my book is that Mount Hope is one of our finest homes today. But if you think about it, it's fine because of its Victorian
Right, that was after
addition.
him, after Coe.
And one of
AC, after
AC, after Coe. One of the things I discovered is I never once found Mount Hope mentioned as a home by anyone during the Civil War, either soldiers who were passing through or locals. And if you think about it, that's a good reason for that. At the time of the Civil War, the only part of Mount Hope that existed was a very humble frame cottage.
Right.
It wouldn't have been terribly noteworthy. The beautiful Victorian edition that we know today dates from something like, what, 1872 or
Yes. Yeah.
something like that. So yes, this was the home for Coe, which he fled and went south so that he could continue preaching, which he did. And the war began.
And Warrenton was the hotbed of Mosby. That's where his home was.
It was. Warrenton was definitely a southern town.
Yes.
Now let's turn to page 24, Dave, because on page 24 and actually on page 25, but I'll just illustrate
Oh,
page
that's
24. This is what happened next. Virginia called a special convention in Richmond, trying to decide what course the state would take. Would it secede or would it not? And Falls Church elected representatives, a man whose name was Delaney, and he lived in the finest home in Falls Church.
And he was a major slaveholder.
He was. The Delaneys were major. The Delaney family actually split itself. One brother was in the Northern Army, that was William Delaney, and then the other brother was in the Southern Army. So it was a nightmare for families like that. And in fact, that family did not survive the war as a family. They lost their family home after the war because of the wartime events. So what I'm illustrating on page 24 is what happened at Falls Church next. The special convention at Richmond decided that it would create an ordinance of secession, which it would then present to Virginia's voters. Virginia's voters would then all go to the polls and decide whether or not to accept the ordinance of secession and take Virginia out of the Union. What happened at Falls Church was especially problematic because at the polling station in Falls Church, which was in our downtown, what is now downtown, what was then downtown?
It was then downtown.
A central intersection, then as now. What happened at the polling station was that armed secessionists were there, and they were threatening the northern-born residents, or in fact anyone who seemed to be that they were going to be voting to keep Virginia in the Union. Now, the way that everyone would have known this is that the secret ballot did not yet exist. And so if you were going to vote, what you would then do is go to the polling station, and in the presence of all your neighbors and the polling supervisors, who were people who would be known to you, you would then announce verbally your choice, no matter what the office or what the issue being decided. So in that particular case, if you keep in mind, it was a very hotly held issue. There are people, I discovered references from Falls Church of people who attended funerals and and described arguments breaking out in the funerals, and also a wedding as to whether or not Virginia should secede. And
so they felt their life was endangered if they voted the wrong way.
They felt that their lives and their livelihoods were endangered if they voted the wrong way. No matter which side they felt, it was the same for both.
So this picture on page 24, it looks like the man behind the yes vote is like the personification of the devil, if you look at that picture. And then
That's right.
Coming out of the no is a bayonet, meaning you're going to get a bayonet if you vote against secession.
That's right. This one comes from the Library of Congress, but the one that I'm not going to illustrate on TV is across the page from that on page 25, and it's a similar lithograph, and it shows a similar thing happening. And that one actually says how Virginia was voted out of the Union, and it shows a man being threatened with his life if he votes no. And so what happened at Falls Church was apparently there were armed Confederate soldiers who were here, a quote mob unquote, at least 15 men, and they verbally and physically threatened people who might vote to keep Virginia in the Union. And so it was not a fair election here.
And we won't go over them now, but you have some wonderful stories in the text here. When I say wonderful, I don't mean happy stories.
But heartbreaking.
Heartbreaking stories like
extremely
Mr.
vivid,
Minor
aren't they?
and stuff. And you were going into some detail on this, which really brought it home for me. And
I know exactly what you're referring to. And as example, in one particular case, a local family named Throckmorton, that was another case in which that family dispatched one man to the Northern Army, one man to the Southern Army. But in that particular case, the Southern Throckmorton told his brother if he voted to keep Virginia in the Union, his life would end that day, as I recall. And the Throckmorton then went to Upton's Hill where they lived, and his brother visited that night. and apparently was going to either kill him or capture him. And so the northern sympathizer, Throckmorton, had to then, run through the fields and escape for his life. He went to Washington and crossed the river.
Wow.
So Dave, it was a nightmare for all involved. And personally, when I wrote this book, I realized you and I and probably everybody else was done a real disservice by our history books, or maybe our history teachers back in school, because they never did drive home, to me at least, what a vivid and what a problematic issue this was. When you learn about it in school, in junior high, suddenly the war started and you're talking about the Battle of Gettysburg and that kind of thing. But for me, writing this book, the fascinating thing in Falls Church was what happened before the war broke out.
That's one of the fascinating things.
There were more to follow.
There were more to follow, and it's all very personal stories. And that's, I think that's what Ken Burns' film did for us in the early 90s with his film coming out. It personalized it a little bit, took it out of the dates and numbers killed concept and made it personal. And that's what your book did. Yeah, and that's what your book has done here for Falls Church. Let's go over another one.
Let's say page 28. You were just mentioning the stories that told. On page 28, the image you're seeing is the actual Ordinance of Secession. This was what the polling supervisors in Falls Church had with them on the day of the vote. And what you're seeing is 2 columns. This is actually a 2-page thing. You're only going to see the first page, I believe. So you're seeing 2 columns, for ratification and against ratification. Now, the column on the left, those will be the people who voted to remove Virginia from the Union. The column on the right will be those who voted to keep Virginia in the Union. Excuse me, I put that wrong. On the left are the people who wanted to remove Virginia from the Union.
Right.
And on the right, the people who wanted to keep Virginia in the Union. I think I said that wrong.
This is real interesting because these names.
The names tell you everything, Dave. And in fact, I want you to notice the first name in each column.
Delaney.
Dulaney and Delaney. Those were brothers. And one went for the South, one went for the North. Can you imagine the arguing that occurred on the day that they both went to the poll? I don't know if they were civil to each other at that point or not, but they were both there together.
And these names, I mean, anybody looking, these are names of streets, these are names of streams, these are names of hills. If you go to the cemeteries, these names are prominent in our local cemeteries.
That's right. These names are very well known to us today, such as Dulaney. There is a Dulaney place in Falls Church, which marks the fact that they owned the largest home here. And then Ashford, I don't know if that's actually not a street name.
The Birch House.
The Birches, the Shreves.
Shreve is big. Haycock.
The Haycocks of Haycock Road.
Of course, Fitzhugh is nothing's named that here, but that's a big name. Ellison.
West.
Clover. We have a Cloverdale area. There's a lot of names. Ives.
Parker. Prout.
Yep. Sewell. There's the Sewell Valley. There's Arthur West. There's West Street.
Kirby.
There's a lot of names that still have a lot of meaning in this town. Even the Bailey. I wonder if that's from the Bailey Circus.
Yes, it was.
Okay.
He came over from Bailey's Crossroads, where he lived. And the interesting thing about this is, apparently you didn't have to vote in any specific polling station. Some of the names on here are people who lived at Bailey's Crossroads, who came to Falls Church. And some Falls Church men voted in Alexandria and at Ballston and at Lewinsville. So.
As many times as possible, probably.
Well, supposedly only once.
Okay.
So I guess my point, Dave, is that the image that you're now seeing, the Ordinance of Secession, every single name here tells quite the story.
Excruciating story.
Yes, it wasn't simply them walking to the voting station and casting their ballot, but rather for everyone featured on the right, they not only cast a ballot, but they also were threatened with their very lives. Now let's move on. Let's turn to page 31.
Oh, there's something. I've heard a lot about this. Professor Lowe's balloon up by where Coons Ford is now.
Yep, this appears to have been a military first, because in what you're seeing here, what's illustrated by this lithograph is the fact that a man named Professor Lowe brought his hot air balloon to Falls Church. He had demonstrated it a few months previous to that for President Lincoln. What he told President Lincoln was, I have this newfangled invention where I've been able to fairly perfect this invention, and I believe that it can be of military use to you because I can go up, I can ascend into the skies, from a certain height I can tell you what enemy armies are doing, or I can describe for you the layout of the terrain, that kind of thing. Well, what you're seeing illustrated here was the first time that the hot air balloon was actually used for such an exact purpose. It was brought to Falls Church, to Taylor's Hill, which is where we, as you mentioned, Coons Ford is today, and the balloon went aloft. Now, probably on TV, the viewers are not going to be able to see it, but I'll point it out just in case they can. In the bottom right-hand corner, you can see...
Oh, a church.
And that is the Columbia Baptist Church, very distinctive New England-style steeple.
It looks like it's the Grand Canyon down there.
It really does. It really does. The only thing I can think is that either the lithographer drew this illustration after the fact, and perhaps he, made the hills look larger, or perhaps they really did look that pronounced.
Artistic license.
Yeah, that could be.
Well known in the journalistic field.
Yes. It practiced then as today. So that was supposedly a military first. Now, let's turn to page 41.
Ooh, a big jump here. We're jumping over a lot of stuff. Haha, yeah, I know this picture.
You know this picture. After the war began, Falls Church was garrisoned by the Union Army, only imperfectly. They never did completely own it. And one of the things that happened to all the Union troops at Falls Church is that they were called to Vienna. Well, they left on a train to go over to Vienna to try to sort of pacify the country, or at least to sort of project their power. Mm-hmm. And that was a disaster for them. What happened was the train, steam trains had to whistle to release the pressure in the engine.
So here we come.
And here we come. As they approached Vienna, the train was whistling loudly. There so happened to be, I think it was the 5th South Carolina Infantry Regiment, which happened to be very near the tracks. They heard the train and decided to gather on the side of the tracks to see what was going to happen. Well, lo and behold, who should sail into their midst but a train full of sitting ducks of Union Army troops.
Yeah.
And so the Southerners opened fire, killed a number of people, bloodied and wounded a number of people, and in fact, the train's engineer panicked and decoupled his locomotive from the rest of the train, and then fled to Falls Church, leaving the stalled train there to be shot at will. Yeah, and they fairly were. And so the men who returned to Falls Church after that battle were not by any means the people who had gone. Many of them were dead, and I don't know, they had to grow up quick after that.
Now, so the train went right through Falls Church.
It did. It started in Alexandria, and the tracks went all the way to Leesburg.
So it crossed Route 7 right where the bike bridge is right now, and crossed Lee Highway right where bicycles cross on the WNOD by Route 66.
That's right. And to give you an idea as to how strange things were in that particular war, at least for Falls Church, the western, where it crosses in West Falls Church today at West Broad Street, that was considered unsafe territory for Union sympathizers or Union Army.
Okay.
You wouldn't want to wander that far from the village center because it was through essentially...
A lot of people still feel that way.
Yeah, well, they probably do, yes. So Eastern Falls Church was the only thing that was actually considered safe.
Now we're making another big jump, eh?
We're going to make another big jump to page...
A lot of history going by.
Page 58. Yeah, we're flying through history, Dave.
Yeah, really, woo. It's just like the last class I took in high school.
Yeah, that's right. Except this time you're not asleep.
So yeah, right.
We're speeding through. Now we're arriving at a map. And I published this map because I thought that the readers and your viewers might find it interesting. The NSAT that you're going to see shows what happened after the first Battle of Bull Run, which was a terrible loss for the Union Army. The Confederate Army captured Falls Church. They did it very quickly. What I illustrate for you here is their diggings.
Now this is the blow up on the lower left you're talking about?
Yes, I think that's what your viewers will be seeing, is just the lower left. And so what they're seeing here are all of the Confederate encampments as they existed in and around Falls Church. In the upper left corner, you will see modern-day Fairfax Street and the intersection of South Washington Street and Broad Street. And you can see Confederate encampments stretching across both sides of Washington Street, as well as on the south side of Broad Street, kind of where the post office is now. And then east of that on...
Oh, and it shows secession pickets, too.
That's right. Those are Confederate pickets.
Yeah.
Those secession pickets. Also, the large fortification you see is on Munson's Hill. And today, at about that same spot, well, not at about that same spot, but just shortly south of that spot is a large apartment tower called Munson's Hill Apartments.
Oh, yeah, right.
So that'll give you a good visual landmark, so you'll know what we're talking about here. So yeah, that fort was very talked about during the opening of the war. The Southerners put guns on it which could target Bailey's Crossroads, and also all the Southerners on top of that hill could be seen from Washington. President Lincoln was said to have used his looking glass or his telescope at the White House from the roof and shown visitors the hill with the Confederate soldiers on it. I'm sure he was not pleased by that. Within view of his home.
Almost as scary as looking at Seven Corners right now.
Isn't it? Isn't it really?
Right.
Just lesser traffic then. Now, Dave, why don't you turn with me to page 62?
Okay. Aha, this was a major find of yours.
I thought that this would be particularly useful to illustrate President Jefferson Davis. At the time he was pictured here, he was still provisional president. They hadn't had regular elections yet to confirm his title as permanent president. But he was the Confederate States president, and he came to Falls Church after his forces occupied Falls Church because they established Confederate Advanced Forces headquarters in what we now know as Lawton House, which is about a block or two from downtown Falls Church.
It's right in back of the State Theater.
Right behind the State Theater. He came to that house because he wanted to visit with his prominent and preeminent Southern generals. What they needed to figure out is what to do.
That must have shown how safe they considered Falls Church.
It was utterly safe. A lot of the Union sympathizers had fled or were driven out of town. And so essentially at that point, it was only Southerners here. And they had occupied all the hills overlooking Washington, including Munson's Hill and Miners Hill and Upton's Hill. And the President Davis came here to talk about what next. Should we fortify Falls Church and make it the next battle zone, or what should happen? What ended up happening is they decided that Falls Church could not be securely fortified from the interior of Virginia. They were afraid that if they established their major armies here, that the Union Army could perhaps sweep across the Potomac River and cut them off. Mm-hmm. And so they decided eventually to withdraw to Manassas, to the heights at Centerville.
Well, yeah, Falls Church is also known as the Gulch because it's a low point, actually.
It is. You can see into it from almost all sides.
Yeah, you can come down from so many different sides. It'd be like a battle of a bull. No, it was the battle over in with Custer's Last Stand.
That's right.
A Wounded Knee. It'd be kind of like that.
They were afraid that it might in fact be that way. And so they made the secret decision that they were going to fortify and garrison Falls Church and its hills that overlooked Washington to keep the Union Army off guard and guessing. Meanwhile, they were actually going to start constructing the real fortifications, which were at Centerville.
Okay.
So for the next chapter, and for the next few months in Falls Church's history, what happened was it was a Confederate town, it was under the Confederate Postal Service, the whole works. But nobody, including the residents in Falls Church, knew that the Confederate Army was going to withdraw.
But this was a major find of yours. I mean, until you said this in the book, I'd read a lot, and I'd never heard that Jefferson Davis had come here and had that meeting. So, I mean, how did you discover that?
He was, do you know, at the moment, now that I'm on the spot, I'm not remembering where I found the records
I remember
of
it was
that.
some kind of a letter that you read.
Seems to me that I did see it
I
in
remember
letters.
you told me that, because I asked that question of you a couple years ago.
One of the troubles with that time is that the Confederate Army records are sort of scattered hither and yon.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them no longer exist, unlike the Union Army records. And so you have to turn to generals' writings, which is what I had to do.
Right. Interesting.
Dave, if you'll turn next to page 67, I wanted to make a point to your viewers that one of the unusual finds when I was doing this book is the number of women involved. Mm-hmm. I really had no idea what to expect when I started this, but what I found is that there were a number of women spies or nurses or simply civilians who were very engaged in affairs who are mentioned frequently. And what you're seeing here is a lithograph of Sarah Emma Edmonds, who was one of the first women I found mentioned in any role. She was actually a nurse, and she almost lost her life as she was crawling on hands and knees to a wounded soldier just below Munson's Hill. And so she is just but the first mention. There are other women to follow. I didn't, for the interest of time and brevity, I didn't point out their pictures as well. Okay. So I'm simply going to have her illustrate the point.
Going by some great pictures here, Brad.
We're going to pass it
at
fast speed by some good pictures.
Great stuff in here.
Why don't you stop at page 75?
I just happened to.
One of the things that happened when the Confederates occupied Munson's Hill is that it was a propaganda nightmare for the Union, because when the Confederates quietly withdrew under cover of darkness on September 28, 1861, what the Union found to its severe embarrassment is that the guns which had fortified Munson's Hill and looked so terrifying from below were actually logs which had been sawed off and painted black, so that they looked, and mounted kind of at an incline, so they looked exactly like cannon barrels.
And they called them?
They called them Quaker guns,
Right.
because the guns wouldn't fire.
Right, just like Quakers.
Just like Quakers.
That was it was part of my ancestry that didn't go to war, were Quakers. Yeah.
And their guns were here, Dave.
Yeah.
I found, to my surprise, I found 3 songs written in either the North or the South chronicling this embarrassing state of affairs, and I published all 3.
So we got The Bold Engineer.
The Bold Engineer, and one is called Munson's Hill, and then on the opposing page, one is called The Battle of the Stovepipes.
Oh, over on page 76, yeah.
And even in the case of Northerners writing these songs, they lambasted the Northern Army
Sure.
for its, what they consider to be its cowardice.
That's easy to say from afar.
It is easy to say from afar.
But if they
those
still,
guns
how
looked-
steep, you know how steep that is coming from the east, going toward the west, going up to Seven Corners. That's an extremely steep hill.
It
I mean,
is,
and who would know? You know, and who would put their life on the line just to find out?
To be simplistic, I like to say anytime you're driving your car and you have to put your foot on the gas pedal, you then know that for someone who was walking or on a horse,
Yeah.
that was actually a considerable incline. Munson's Hill, as you just said, is one. And I should point out to you, Dave, that as tall as it seems now, it actually is nothing like what it was in the war, because it was developed in 1955 to make way for houses and apartment tower. And so bulldozers scalped the
Flattened
top of the
top,
page.
yeah.
Exactly.
Sure.
And it probably lost about 15 feet off the top.
All
Or more.
all around Falls Church, that's happened. The hills are lower. They're
It is, yeah.
They're not alive with the sound of music. They're alive with the sound of bulldozers,
Bulldozers, yeah.
cutting them down. Right.
So Munson's Hill, just if you can in
Okay.
your imagination, pretend that it seemed that it
Okay.
was larger, more formidable at the time.
Right.
Now let's go on to page 89.
And still
we,
passing
We
some
are skipping
great-
merrily through history
Oh,
here.
look at all these. Whoa.
I tell you, Dave, only an hour. It's
Oh.
not enough time to cover
It
this
isn't.
story.
We're getting close now too. 89, you said. Okay.
89. What your viewers are now seeing is a photo I took. I found this in the Library of Congress, and the reason I used it is because the man for whom it was issued, Smith Minor, was
yeah.
a man who lived between Falls Church and what is now Ballston, which was then called Ball's Crossroads. And what this is it's a permit allowing him to leave his farm. All local residents had to have permits which were recognized by whatever army that might stop them. Now, keep in mind, for Falls Church, that was awful, because you know, depending on where they lived, Southern Army might sweep through, and then the next day the Union Army might sweep through. And in both cases, if you were caught from your farm with the permit of an opposing army on you, you might then be arrested or persecuted.
Right.
And so many local residents had to keep permits from both armies and keep that fact hidden.
In different shoes.
In different shoes, as it
Right.
were. The pass that you see here is issued by the Union Army, and it actually is from later in the war, 1865.
It
but
is late May of 65. Wow.
it was very similar to the ones that were issued at the beginning of the war and that Falls Church people had to have on them all throughout the war. And you'll notice on the back side of it, which I also feature, is the Oath of Allegiance, to remind Falls Churchers that they had to take the Oath of Allegiance and keep it. Now, a few pages later, page 92, I show, and your viewers are now seeing, Chainbridge as it looked then. It had long since stopped being made of anything that resembled chains.
I was
and
going to say this.
it was a wooden board bridge at that time.
That's a lot of trees there. Wow.
A lot
Look
of
at
trees.
Those arches are just beautiful.
They really are. And actually, below the bridge, Dave, you can only barely make it out, are either oxen or cattle of some kind.
I see those, yes.
So, you know, it was very pastoral and idyllic then.
Well, it doesn't look that pastoral. Actually, if you look, it's all sand. I don't see a plant down there.
You know,
and
I
if you-
don't either.
and when you go over there now, there's a lot of plants.
There is a lot of plants. The reason I illustrate the bridge to begin with is because of what happened at the bridge. Falls Church, not only did it offer something in military history as being a first, and that was the first time that aerial surveillance via hot air balloon was used to target to see where the enemy was. Well, it was a second military first too, one that was perhaps even more inglorious than the first. They took that earlier success in being able to see the enemy at a distance, and they decided, why not let's try to use the hot air balloon at a distance and maybe target the enemy. That had never been done before. Artillery shells are always fired apparently in point of view. You could always see who you were firing at. So what happened is the Union Army established itself at the Virginia end of the Chain Bridge and sent up Professor Lowe in his hot air balloon. He then targeted Falls Church. So did the artillery guns.
So we're the first village,
sadly to say,
to be bombed.
We were the first village to be
reconnaissance.
That's exactly right. And
that's a dubious distinction.
And boy, was it a success.
So that's why our business district has never survived.
Well, yeah, exactly. That's why it looks the way it does.
Okay.
What the Union Army gunners did is they were supposed to be aiming for the Belfry Tower of Columbia Baptist Church. And they didn't hit the Belfry Tower, but they did hit the village, and it caused the village to be evacuated for what seems to me to be something like at least a week or 2 weeks. And if you'll keep in mind, the villagers were absolutely mystified. They knew the Union Army at that point was not within at least 2 or 3 miles, so it was clearly out of sight, and yet it was targeting somehow the village accurately. What they didn't know is that Professor Lowe had gone aloft in his balloon and was signaling the gunners on the ground, target your fire a little to the right or to the left or up or down. And so that was a success, and clearly it's used in warfare all over now. And that had an unhappy, vainglorious start in Falls Church.
So not only was our town the first to be bombarded, the first target was a church. That's really interesting. That is a really interesting concept. Yeah.
And as I said again, keep in mind, their first target was a church in a very religious age.
Yeah.
So that goes to show you how willing they were to do anything if it took to win the war.
And how quickly all that faith was lost.
That is true. Now, Dave, let's spin through history yet some more to page 112.
You are going by a lot of stuff here. Wow.
I am going by fast. We don't have a choice.
Okay. Okay, I remember this now.
This is one of my favorite lithographs. Now, Dave, what I did to find information is I had to identify the Army regiments which were headquartered in Falls Church. Then I would identify their hometowns. And then I would identify the newspapers published in their hometowns during the Civil War. And then finally, I would take those titles to Falls Church's public library and have those wonderful people there bring them in for me on microfilm.
So this whole process took what, about 2 minutes? 2 minutes?
Oh yeah.
Right.
And inevitably,
Right,
the microfilm would arrive from, say, New York State or wherever it came from on about a Thursday. And inevitably, I would be told the lending library is only lending it to you for, 2 or 3 days. And so inevitably, I would spend the weekend in the Falls Church's library going through microfilm. But
that's what most people do, actually.
Is that what most people do?
Right.
In this particular case of this lithograph, I'm so glad I did, because we had always seen this published, and it was said that it shows the men of the 37th, it was an a Union regiment, the 37th Infantry treeing, quote unquote, a rebel. And if you look in the background, you can see them treeing other rebels too. I mean, there's at least 2 rebels here.
Right, I see that.
What actually happened was, as I found in a newspaper from New York State, the actual regiment was the 35th Regiment. They were headquartered at the site now of Coons Ford and Oakwood Cemetery. And they were very upset by that because they were misidentified. It was them treating the rebels, not the 37th. That was posted over at Ballston
How
somewhere.
dare they?
How dare the publishers make that mistake? And so it wasn't until I got the newspaper from New York State that I realized, wow, so it was actually, that makes more sense to know this.
Well, I feel like a better person.
Right. I published this because it's, number one, it's a colorful lithograph. I mean, it's black and white, but I mean, it's very action-oriented.
Right.
But it also shows you a lot of what was happening in Falls Church. Rebels really were treed or driven up trees or
Well, we're still driven up trees here in Falls Church, and then
are?
they cut the trees down. And
That's exactly right. Fortunately, we're a tree city. That doesn't hurt. Dave, turn with me to page 115.
Okay.
What was now happening was the Union Army, as you've just heard, had begun garrisoning Falls Church after the Confederates withdrew. And they began putting many, many men on Upton's Hill and Miners Hill. But at this point in the game, only Upton's Hill was garrisoned. The men that you're seeing here were from New York's 23rd Infantry Regiment. And this is a photo by the famous Matthew Brady. And I got this photo from the National Archives. The thing is, we didn't realize it was Falls Church, because it's not written on the back that it's Upton's Hill or Falls Church.
Right.
It simply says the regiment and the date. And I know exactly where the regiment was in its entirety during that date.
It
and
took
was
so much
Upton's Hill.
research.
It took a lot of research, but the fruits and the product were great.
Yeah, I recognize that tree in the back there.
Yeah, do you?
We just cut it down, actually.
Dave, I also want you to notice, if you can see in your copy, the men are actually having a good time.
Oh yeah, and in fact, they look like they could be living today. They
really
somehow how old photographs, people say, oh, those people couldn't live today, but these look like faces that you could see around.
Absolutely. In fact, I know the man who's lying on his side, the leftmost man, he's kind of smiling. I know a man who looks virtually identical to that.
In fact, the guns they're carrying, you just generally see going up and down the street, too.
Yeah, yeah. Very, very known to us.
Right.
Now, let's turn to page 131.
Feeling I should be starting to sing, you know? It's a church here. Okay.
The next event to make the history books from Falls Church was what the federal government called the affair at Doolin's Farm. And this
is public television now. Can we talk about an affair?
Yes, we may.
Okay.
Yes, we may. What they referred to as an affair was any event. And this event was an absolute disaster for the Union Army. I still can't imagine after researching it that it ever occurred. But the troops in this area were led by a political general, a man named General Wadsworth. His actual wish was to be governor of New York State. And he accepted a commission.
And this was a close second.
And this was a close second. At that time, he was put in charge of the New York troops. I mean, this was before there was a regular federal army. That didn't occur until something like World War I think. And so at that time, the states would actually appoint their own generals for the most part. And he was appointed in New York State. He came here in charge of the New York troops, and the man was my point of view is the man was a disaster. In this particular case, he sent a large body of Union troops to the neighborhood of Doolin's Farm, which I mentioned was, off sort of where West Street dead ends at Lee Highway. And they engaged or were ambushed by the Confederates. And it did not go well for the Union.
That's the top of a hill. That's right. That's the top of a hill there.
His farmhouse is actually right in the cluster of tall, high-rise buildings now called Fairview Park.
Oh,
so
it's the next hill.
It's one hill over.
Okay, good. I know what you're talking. That's another hill, yeah.
It's another hill. The farmhouse was not exactly centered in the property, so to speak.
Okay.
And so the Union general sent his men there, and they were ambushed, and something like 40 of them were captured, and all their goods and store of wagons and horses and everything. I mean, it was just, to use the vernacular, a frickin' disaster. And to my surprise and horror, actually horror, if you'll turn one page over to page 135, it happened again. I couldn't believe this. In what the federal government called the affair at Brush's Farm. It happened just days after the horrible event at Doolin's Farm when 40 soldiers were captured, and it was the exact same thing happening. The Union general sent his men.
Is this the same general?
The same general sent his men without sufficient escort into areas clearly held by Confederate sympathizers and canvassed by the Confederate Army. And so what this lithograph shows you is the illustration which the London Illustrated News published. So as you can see, news of this went worldwide. But this is the way the lithographer thought the fight probably took place.
That is an interesting picture, because the way the Confederate soldiers, they look like dashing cavaliers with the feathers in their cap going backward, and look at the way they have the tree
Union
on
Army
the right bending toward them, like saying,
That's right.
These guys are going to get it, on the left, the Union. And
they got it, Dave.
Yeah, it's quite a picture.
No, this lithograph is actually artist license writ large, because all of the descriptions of that farm, which I found in soldiers' letters or diaries or military reports, it doesn't sound as though it looked like that at the farmhouse.
Okay.
So this probably is not exactly how it
Sure.
looked, but it definitely illustrates the fight that took place.
It looks like it was at Sleepy Hollow, New York,
Right. Now, Dave, another first for Falls Church.
Oh, I can't wait.
Flip with me to page 139.
Okay.
On page 139 are going to be two images, and I believe your viewers are going to see both. The image of the woman
Yes.
shows Julia Ward Howe. Now, Falls Church is it's an unknown first, so it doesn't actually make the history books until now, but I hope we become better known for this. Julia Ward Howe is known for writing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And in fact, she wrote that at Upton's Hill at Falls Church. And the reason that she wrote it was there was supposed to be a very large Union military review taking place on the top of Upton's Hill. And she came out from Washington with other dignitaries, including the governor of Massachusetts and some other people, in a carriage. And so they came to the Hill to watch what was supposed to be a grand review of troops. Well, during the grand review of troops was one of the engagements on the other side of Falls Church at either Brush's or Doolin's Farms. I'm forgetting which. And the people at Upton's Hill got word of it, and the grand review was canceled in mid-review, and a lot of the soldiers rushed toward Falls Church to see if they could put down whatever was happening. And so with the review ended, Julia Ward Howe and the other dignitaries got into their carriage and started back for Washington. And at that point, it had grown dark, and they were on the road that we now know today as Wilson Boulevard. At that time, it was called the Aqueduct Road. And there were a lot of soldiers in front of and behind them and on either side of them, also walking toward Ballston, where they had been encamped. And the soldiers were singing the tune John Brown's Body, which goes something like, John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in its grave.
Oh yeah, famous
And
song.
so, you know, the words are extremely violent. And one of the people in the carriage told Julia, who was a known poet, I wish you would write new words to that song. And Julia Ward Howe said something to the effect of, oh, how I wish I should or might. Well, nothing more was spoken about it. She thought no more about it. The carriage made its way back to Washington. She went to the Willard Hotel for the night, and she awoke early the next morning before dawn. And as she lay in bed, the words began kind of coalescing in her mind. And she began forming them into stanzas and more complete and concrete. And she realized that something fairly monumental was happening to her. And so she got out of bed, lit a lamp, and wrote the words down so that she didn't forget them. And then she went back to bed. Well, the basic words became a poem which was later published as Battle Hymn of the Republic by the Atlantic Monthly in 1862. By the end of the Civil War, that had been put to, I think, the tune of John Brown's Body.
Right, it is, yeah.
And was sung by Union soldiers throughout the North. And so that is something which is still with us today. Battle Hymn of the Republic
Sure
is still a famous song.
It certainly is.
And it got its start at Falls Church.
And those,
And Dave, I believe we should get the credit for that.
oh, okay. So all those fires that they're talking about were right here.
Yes. The
Okay.
watchfires and the 100 encircling camps, she saw all of that here.
Wow. Well, Brad, we only have about 5 more minutes, believe it or not.
We do, and I'm going to try to be
So
fast.
we have about 5 more years to go.
We do, and we're not going to do a very good job of that, are we, Dave?
No.
No, we're going to have to leave out a lot. Dave, how about if I paw through quickly, given that we only have about 5 minutes? Dave, turn with me to page 168 and 169. I would like your viewers to see what one of the fortifications in Falls Church looked like. The fort that you see in both the photo and the lithograph your viewers will be shown from pages 168 and 169 show Fort Ramsey, which was atop Upton's Hill.
If you didn't tell me this, I just looked at this, I would tell you that this was a reenactment. I don't know, there's something about it.
It looks the same, I think.
No, no, but it almost looks like this happened now and just reenactors doing this.
It's a very clear photo.
It is.
And in fact, I'd like your viewers to note the tower that's built on the house in the background. That house is not the house they know now. This site is actually the site of the Blue Water Tower on the very top of Upton's Hill,
Okay.
where Wilson Boulevard links with a very small street called McKinley Avenue, I think.
Isn't there some kind of a
And there are brick
baseball
apartment.
and miniature baseball batting cage up near there somewhere?
Not within view of the site,
Okay.
but it's just downhill.
Okay.
Well, the house that was there at that time was a congressman's house, and the Union Army confiscated it and built that tower on top.
Oh, and you can see it on the right-hand picture too, yeah.
Yes, you can see it on both photos actually, and that tower gave them line-of-sight communications with the Washington Monument.
Okay.
It was only half finished at that time, but still, it gave them
Okay.
line-of-sight communications. Now, Dave, let's turn to page 180. I would like your viewers to see a one-of-a-kind, full-color lithograph published.
And this was on the cover of your book.
This is the cover of my book because it's so outstanding. This shows an encampment of Rhode Island soldiers. Their camp, called Camp Owen, overlooked the village of Falls Church, right across 4 Mile Run from where we are today. And you can see all kinds of detail in this lithograph. You can see the wooden huts that they built. You can see the huge Sibley tents. You can see the wives of visiting officers. But Dave, let's not tarry there.
But how did you find that picture?
I found that picture, believe it or not, on eBay. And it seems to be a one-of-a-kind. I've written every archive and museum and art collection in the state of Rhode Island, and no one professes to own it or to have ever seen it.
Do you own it now?
I own it now,
Wow.
and I have made copies for the Falls Church Library, so exact
Yeah.
copies are now
That is
publicly
great.
available. And actually, that was better. I didn't want to donate it because it's got mold growing on the back. And so the photos are exact replicas without the mold.
Yeah, good for you.
Now, Dave, turn with me to page 186. I think your viewers ought to see what the interior of the Falls Church Episcopal looked like during wartime. The furniture was removed by the soldiers who used it as a stable and also as a hospital.
So there's 2 pictures here.
There are 2 photos, and I'd like your viewers to see both. if that's possible.
Yes.
And in the background, I want you to notice that the walls in every direction are covered with graffiti. And the graffiti are soldiers' names, which they wrote in charcoal. And in fact,
Some things don't change, do they?
Some things don't change. And I looked up some of the names, and I was able to see exactly when they were in Falls Church, so I know exactly when some of the names would have been written. I also know what happened to those people later on during the war. Now, Dave,
do you say that in the book in here?
yes, I do.
Okay.
I mentioned to you what
Okay.
occurred. Dave, what a nightmare that we're having to summarize so quickly so much history. Why don't you turn with me to page 210? It doesn't have a page number on it, but it's across from 211. This shows the hangman's tree. I think your viewers might want to see an example of a myth which
Yes.
was with us all the way from Civil War times.
Right.
The myth was that Colonel Mosby, who raided Falls Church repeatedly during the latter part of the war, the myth was that Colonel Mosby and his men hanged Union sympathizers or their enemies from this particular tree.
Probably the branch that went over Broad Street right there. Yeah.
And Broad Street's what you see in the background. It's stretching toward West End. And at this point, you can see it's only 2 lanes. And this was in about the late 1940s, I think, early 1950s. As it turns out, I was never able to substantiate that myth. I call it a myth. I don't believe that it actually happened. Mosby and his men were very careful. They were very proud to document everything they did in Falls Church. The Union Army was very unproud, but also documented everything Mosby did in Falls Church. At no point do I ever find reference to anyone being hanged here.
Right.
The closest they come is they kidnapped one of our citizens and executed him. And the execution happened out at Hunter's Mill.
Right.
So this is an example of a myth debunked as a result of our research.
Okay.
Now finally, Dave, I guess we'll end with page 223.
Wow, we are really jumping over stuff here.
Well, in fact, we've jumped through the end of the war. The war has now ended by page 223.
Okay.
And I wanted to show you the urn
Oh,
that
yes.
you see in the top, and this will be the top photo, it's about the only surviving colonial era artifact in the Falls Church Episcopal today. The reason being the church was looted by soldiers during the war. This urn happened to be returned after the war. Otherwise, it would not be there now. After the war, the Falls Church Episcopal was rebuilt on the inside by the Union government, or by the federal government. And the last picture that you'll see at the bottom of page 223 shows you what it looks like today, thanks to the repairs that the Union Army executed after the war. Now, Dave, that was 4 or 5 years in rapid fire talk. Did I leave anything out your viewers need to know about, or?
Well, I think that it's just important to know that people barely survived, and the war totally changed Falls Church forever from where it was heading at the time, and actually made Falls Church into a more cosmopolitan area, because after the Civil War, then the Northerners moved down, and then the Southerners, some stayed, some left, and there's huge changes, and you document some of this back on chapter 12 and going on. So I think it's important for people to know that the Civil War didn't just happen and then stopped.
Nope, it stayed with us. Locals said that the divisions between Northerners and Southerners locally stayed with them all the way through World War I. Which is amazing.
Well, I'd say beyond that, 10 years ago when I started working on the Tinner Hill Festival, I was pulled aside by some people who lived here a long time and essentially told to not do that because the wounds were so deep and the divisions were so harsh that it would be an unpleasant thing to bring up. But
it's amazing, isn't it?
it is. This was just 10 years ago. So I want to thank you for showing us just a small hint of this book. There are over 250 illustrations in this book and great stories that you documented, and that this book is not always easy to find. I know we're selling it at the farmer's market in Falls Church on Saturday mornings for 27 weeks when it doesn't rain. And then it's available at a few stores in Falls Church, like Kennedy's, Natural Foods, and the art and framing store on the 200 block of West Road, Hole in the Wall.
And the antique store on South Washington Street.
On South Washington Street, right? Yeah, Old Market Antiques. Anywhere else? How else can they buy it?
The other place is at Borders in Bailey's Crossroads.
Okay.
Or they are welcome to contact me because, believe it or not, all of the books ended up in my basement. I don't own the book now.
We don't say that on camera.
Oh, well, this is true, but I'm in charge of distributing them, so I'd be happy to sign or mail or present whatever they need.
And how do they contact you?
I am listed in the phone directory.
Okay, under Bradley Gernand.
Gernand with a G.